Okay. My contribution is a little more abstract and less historical. Or I guess if it's historical in the, as Catherine put it, in sort of broad sweeping sense. It comes of, is a culmination of many years of thinking about how people like me who are professional thinkers and researchers and writers, you know, can be of assistance to social movements. Because it strikes me that the sort of traditional paradigm, the sort of vanguardist paradigm, the intellectuals are there to come up with the correct analysis of the world situation and, you know, come up with strategically appropriate things for people to do and tell people what to do. Well, we know where that leads. That approach has been broadly rejected by most sensible people, but it kind of leaves a big question mark of what do we do, other than go out there and hold placards, which anybody can do. And I mean, it seems there's many, many possible answers to this, and don't want to prioritize one to the other. You know, among them are you can provide information and resources that other people don't have access to for particular things they need. You can, one model I came up with at one point, you can kind of do ethnographic work on movements themselves to sort of tease out some underlying assumptions and principles they're developing they might not be fully consciously aware of, which is what anthropologists are trained to do, and sort of take that same logic and apply it to other things they might not have applied it to. You can, I actually am a big fan of research for its own sake being, in a way, sort of what I call the utopian moment of intellectual life. A lot of people accused me of thinking, you know, sort of chiding academics for not being more politically engaged, but I actually don't think that. I think it's great that there are people who spend their life studying Provençal musical instruments from the Middle Ages and things like that. I mean, we should all ultimately be able to do what we like in that sort of way. They're living utopia in a certain sense, and somebody should be, provide a model and inspiration to others. But I think the most important thing on some level we can do is intervene in sort of very, very basic common sense assumptions. This is, of course, what anthropologists are best at. So I decided to write a section for this book, which was meant to be about as provocative as you can be in this context, on communism, which is a word which you just can't use without getting people excited, for better or worse, usually worse, in a million different ways. And I wrote one that would both annoy people, both communists and anti-communists equally, I thought. Or at least those who are most dedicated to either of those positions. I argue that the entire conception we have of this is misplaced. And I think it's really important to make an intervention here, because there's a certain ideological work being done by the common sense application of these terms that I don't think we really think about very often. I was reminded of this when now I'm with a friend's family, friend with a 12-year-old daughter, and they were discussing how to do some project together, and the daughter was suggesting they do it in a democratic and equal way, and of course the mother immediately said, yes, but that would be communism, and we all know that communism doesn't work. And you know, millions of parents say this to their kids all the time. And it's a very, very strange logic, because it almost always is made to refer to things which have absolutely nothing to do with the way that what we now call communist regimes were actually organized at all. I remember, you know, when I was a teenager, worked in restaurants, and a lot of my friends had exactly the same experience. If you propose that people, you know, all make a decision together in a reasonable way, or that things be equally distributed, or anything like that, that things aren't done in a sort of top-down, hierarchical, arbitrary fashion, the immediate response is actually two of them. One is that this isn't communism, and the other one is this isn't a democracy. And these two terms are actually used interchangeably, very interestingly. So it's important to intervene on the level of common sense, I think. There's a question of how successful you can be in doing so. At least you can try to change the commonplace discourse. So and in some ways I was inspired by Marcel Mauss. He's this person who sort of opened my eyes to this, not in The Gift, which everybody reads, but in some of his other work, which no one seems to read, notably his ethnographic book, how to do ethnography. He never did ethnography himself, but he taught a series of courses on how to do it, which inspired almost all French anthropologists who came after him. And one of the points he kept making was that everything is sort of that we tend to dichotomize, tends to exist at the same time in all human societies. I wasn't actually entirely sure about the market or capitalism, but he did say, for example, communism and individualism almost always coexist. In fact, there's no contradiction between them. Democracy and monarchy always coexist in any society, so forth and so on. There's many examples you can tease out of it. But his usage of communism struck me as very interesting, because Mose was very, very critical of communes in his day that tried to absolutely eliminate individual possession and everything should be owned in common. He said, this is stupid. There's never been a society in human history where there's no individual possessions. So I guess he wouldn't have really approved of like a lot of the kibbutzim where they all shared shirts and things like that. At the same time, part of that was because he didn't think that communism was supposed to be about the common possession. It wasn't a property arrangement. Property is largely a matter of legalism and title. What's really important, he said, was who has access to what in what context. So you could have things which in theory are individually owned, but everybody could have access to it in the right circumstance, and rules of access can be very different. Or you can have systems where, which in fact you do all the time, of collective ownership, where one person actually controls everything. I mean, to make an obvious example, I'm an American citizen, so in theory, like, I'm co-owner of the White House. So what? It doesn't mean that I can walk in. It doesn't mean I won't get shot if I try. So what if you move away from property? He says, well, you need to look at he doesn't quite say this, but it pretty much comes out. You need to go back to the original definition, which goes back, was first in writing, not by Marx actually, but by Louis Blanc, of communism is the principle of from their abilities to each according to their needs. And he said you find out that rather than there being a contradiction between individualism and communism, there's such a thing as individualistic communism. There's a lot of individuals I treat like that. We share, if they need something, I will give it to them, my best friend, my blood brother, whatever it might be. So in fact, most societies are threaded about by networks of individualistic communism. But the conclusion that I came to is that we just need to change the narrative, because we're haunted by this myth. Once upon a time, it goes back at least to the Roman jurists, probably before, traces of it in Greece. Once upon a time, there was this time when like everything was owned in common and people were happy, and even if like food didn't come out of the ground and cook itself, everything was pretty easy. We shared, and somehow serpent got into the garden, everything fell apart, there was some kind of fall, and since then war and property had emerged alongside each other, and someday we're going to get rid of it again. And that sort of narrative, I call it, sort of mythological communism. My friends call it epic communism, which is kind of nice. It's a narrative that's propped up periodically throughout, certainly throughout Western history and throughout other histories as well. And of course that was the narrative of the people who called themselves communists, who were communist regimes in no case that I'm pretty sure actually claimed to be living under communism or producing communism. They were under socialism, and communism was this sort of distant thing where we've finally gotten rid of the state and it's withered away, and we hunt in the morning and fish in the afternoon. Now, so let's say if you just get rid of that whole thing, think beyond it. It struck me that it's much more interesting, because if you look at, well, when do people act on the principle of from each according to their abilities to each according to their needs? What you find is that a certain degree of communism, by that definition, is the baseline of almost all human social relations. I mean, everybody has to be at least sort of minimally communistic to each other if they are friends at all.